Let's talk about C.S. Forester and his Horatio Hornblower series. C.S. Forester was a very popular author and novelist, screenwriter, and at times he was one of the most popular writers in his country. He specialized in historical adventures. He specialized in sort of tales that brought to life some moment in the usually in the British imperial past, and fictionalized it and made it dramatic. He His main series was the Adventures of Horatio Hornblower, who was a naval officer during the Napoleonic Wars, which took place from roughly 1795 to 1815. And this was a very popular character, but he had many others that were successful standalone novels that focused in on one moment in British history and sort of turned it into a sort of a cinematic epic adventure. He was a popular screenwriter, and he knew the beats of sort of Hollywood of the time. He was most active from 1930 to 1960, I want to say. I think that's when the last Hornblower book came out. And there's a number of things that make his work still worth reading. One is his meticulous research. He really studied the actual history of the times in which he wrote, and although not everything that happens in the books is very likely, none of it is impossible. He knew the conditions under which his characters labored. He studied the equipment very closely. He learned a great deal of nautical stuff. Uh, I think the story I read once is that he found a collection of the Naval Chronicle, which was the British Navy's, magazine, essentially, in which they also wrote, stories of what the Navy was up to. It was kind of the equivalent of Stars and Stripes for the U.S. Army. And he just read all of these from that era, fascinated, and learned sort of the tone and the details of the life of the times. The Napoleonic War era for the British Navy is a really popular moment of history to study, partly because it became the focus of so much British mythologizing, and the cult of Admiral Nelson. But it was, they were vital events. Maybe there's a rule that institutions tend to remember and record, archive material from those moments where they can feel that they are sort of the most vitally engaged with world affairs. So he knew his research really well, and when you read something happening in one of his books, you can trust that he has studied the geography, the weather, that he's presented stuff plausibly. And after a while, this just becomes, sort of the background assumption of reading his books. And he did this. This is now, I don't know, perhaps somewhat expected of the historical fiction trade, but at the time it was far more rare, and there was much more just kind of general, slipshod adventurist work. There was all this pulp fiction about different historical events that did not expect a high degree of research or historical realism. So thank you for that, CS. It is very good. It adds a lot to your stories. The part that's even more interesting to me, though, reading it now, is the historical context in which these books arose. By the 30s, when Forster was creating Hornblower, I haven't gone back to check, but I'm pretty sure the first Hornblower book came out in 35. or 36. And I don't believe he had any intention of writing a series. I think it just emerged, and the last one was uncompleted at the time of his death in, I believe, 1961. So over a period of 25 years, he wrote 11 of these books. They hop sort of backwards and forwards in time. We begin with Hornblower already as a captain, and then, many of the books go earlier than that and give us his earlier career, and then some of them move forward again, so that you're reading them all out of order. But these days, of course, they're published with guides, so you can start at the beginning from him as a young man and watch him rise, or you can flip flop around. Anyway, so the historical context in which they arose, by the time he was creating Hornblower, there was a long tradition of using genre fiction as part of a public relations sort of campaign for contemporary issues. So, not propaganda exactly, but getting publishing things and making them aware to the public based partly on contemporary concerns. And like one example would be before World War One, there was a well-known thriller called The Riddle of the Sands, and it's not as good as the Forrester books, but it was by a guy named Erskine Childers. He was a British journalist, and there was a lot of concern in Britain about Germany's rise, and especially about Germany's intent to build a navy that would be capable of competing with the British Navy. So Erskine Childers wrote a thriller involving a secret plan for a German invasion of Britain by boat over the North Sea, and it was wildly successful and really tapped into something that a lot of British people were feeling. Even though I don't think it's a particularly good book, it was just the right thing for that time and played on these deep fears. And this is not over. There was recently a well-known thriller in Turkey that really played on Turkey's fears of the U.S. and of Israel, that did staggeringly well there. I think it was something of an alternate history as well. In any case, this is now a very established trope. We expect that now and then there will be a work of fiction that speaks directly to contemporary concerns about politics, about strategic concerns involving particular countries, or what have you. When I was a kid, the big name in this field was Tom Clancy. It felt like at the time that Tom Clancy was sort of like looking through the world one at a time, looking for areas where you might call them hot spots, and thinking, oh, how can I get a thriller out of this that will speak to Americans? Well, anyway, in the 30s, C.S. Forrester was a British writer, and he was living in America, and there was a deep concern, especially once World War II started in 1939. There was a deep concern in the United Kingdom that the United States, should become a British ally and should see Britain as their friend. And so there was a lot before the war, and then especially once the war started, there was a lot of, I guess you could call them like influence operations, public relations operations designed to move American public opinion to favoring Britain. And Forrester was part of this. His knowledge of Hollywood and of the American publishing world and just the American cultural scene was very valuable at the time, because this wasn't anything sordid exactly or anything, but it was more about overwhelming American isolationist sentiment. There was a strong feeling in the U.S. in the 30s that the world should leave the U.S. alone, because the U.S. leaves the world alone, and the rest of the world should sort of solve its own problems, and that the U.S. should not commit itself to fighting another war on behalf of European powers. Like in World War One, it was felt that this had been a big mistake, and that they should do their thing, and we should do our thing. Britain, well, some elements in Britain, but powerful elements. Winston Churchill, for one, and other leaders saw this as a real danger, and it was apparent that if there was another war, that U.S. Military, economic power would be a key element in it. Should whether they withheld it or whether they didn't. And so there was a long effort on the part of British, I guess, culture workers, screenwriters like Forrester, journalists, newspaper editors, filmmakers, to create works that would appeal to the U.S. and create a sense that Britain was a valuable ally, that Britain was a a sort of a natural partner in U.S. values. You can see this in a lot of the Hollywood movies. It's easy to see once the war starts. There were these Sherlock Holmes movies that were really designed to, because he was always a popular character in the U.S., and they were really designed to sort of associate Sherlock Holmes with Britain, and thus, if you loved Sherlock Holmes, you must love Britain. There were all sorts of swashbuckler movies with guys like Errol Flynn and Tyrone Power, and they would often recast British characters as sort of the dashing heroes of the past in a way that would appeal to Americans and make them sort of identify with them and see Britain as the American heroes who just happen to have a different accent. And there were a lot of works that dug into British imperial history, sometimes not that long ago, 19th century, and sort of adopted a Western format for Americans so that they could understand British imperial history not as a violent subjugation of native peoples, but more as their own, similar to the Americans' own, conquest of virgin territory, manifest destiny, the various excuses that the U.S. used to understand its own violent subjugation of native peoples as something different. The British tried to attach their history into that formula so that it could be understood by U.S. audiences as, ethically okay. And Forrester was part of this, and the Hornblower character in particular was a real success for him at taking Hornblower's fictional, but he's based on what he actually did is based on sort of the actions of real naval officers from that era. But Hornblower's character and the structure of the stories was designed to appeal to Americans, taking a British character who was born in about 1770, I want to say, and giving him the qualities that would appeal to Americans in the 30s and 40s. And I found that very, very interesting. So there are certain things that about Hornblower that are just like historically unlikely. As I say, nothing's impossible about what he does or about the settings in which he involved. In fact, sometimes he's involved in settings that are very closely based on actual battles or actual engagements. But his attitude towards things is the attitude of a sort of middle-class American in the 30s and 40s instead of a naval officer in the 1780s and 90s. So, for example, even though flogging and corporal punishment were very common in the British Navy of this time as a means of keeping discipline in ships, but Hornblower hates it, and he almost never orders it. And when he does, Forrester makes a point of telling us how bad he feels about it. He always looks for some other way out instead of flogging, and he's presented as a very, progressive-minded about these issues. And not every American in the 30s and 40s would have been against flogging, adults, or would have been horrified by it, but a few would, right? Some would. And if Hornblower had seemed to be neutral or even to approve of it as a means of discipline, it would have distanced that bit of the audience from his character. So he has a very progressive attitude on corporal punishment for his time. Again, not impossible, but designed. Another thing, at the time, the British Navy gave its officers and men what they called prize money. It was like an incentive to get them to fight the war better. So if a ship was flying the flag of a country you were at war with, you could, overtake the ship and you could seize it, and the ship itself, and if you could get it back to a British port, it would be inspected and it would be declared a prize. And then the ship itself and its cargo would be sold, and the money would be given mostly to the ship that seized it. So it was like I'm trying to remember. The captain got like an eighth of the value of the ship. The men got like an eighth. Officers got they would divvy it up. There were these strict rules about it, and this was supposed to give officers and captains a strong incentive to be aggressive and to really fight the war well, because if they kept looking and they found something, it could be a life-changing amount of money for these guys, and they did get paid, but in addition to their regular pay, you got prize money. So there were times where a lucky captain who was in the right place and seized a valuable cargo could instantly rise, through society, and they could buy a house, buy a carriage, afford to get married. It was a big deal. But of course, to 20th century eyes, this might look a little bit like legalized piracy. This might look a little greedy, and the culture of that day associated military virtue with sort of disinterested patriotism, and this was never really part of the U.S. military tradition, this kind of prize money. I don't say it didn't happen ever, but it wasn't like familiar to U.S. audiences. And so in order to get his audience to sympathize with his main character, because you're writing general fiction for a large audience, people pretty much always have to sympathize with the main character. That's what keeps them in the story. And Hornblower is the reader analog character. He's the character through whom you experience the story and through whom it flows, with one exception. One of the books, which actually is one of the best of the books, is seen through the eyes of Hornblower's friend, Lieutenant Bush. And I can only assume this was like an experiment in structuring the story differently. And for me, it was a successful one. I thought it was quite cool to see how Hornblower appeared to someone else and to have that person experience the story. Bush is a very direct kind of character, so he's, he has it has a fun way of presenting, how he gradually comes to know Hornblower's character. It's like how they first meet. Hornblower also has a major secret to keep in the course of the story, and if he were the reader analog character, it would be a little more difficult to keep that secret, so we understand. But I digress. So to keep Hornblower sympathetic so that audiences will continue to accept him as, sort of their heroic entree into the story, he never gets any prize money. It becomes a joke. Something he's known for is, even under conditions where he doesn't mind the idea too much. He does criticize the whole system quietly to himself a couple of times, as I recall. But he is not averse to the idea of prize money, and he certainly knows what it means to his crew, and how much it matters to them to have the occasional, big payday, and to his officers. Bush in particular really could use money because he's like supporting a bunch of adult sisters. So he definitely tries, and he's trying to do his duty, but more than once he puts in a situation where, in order to do his duty, he has to sink or destroy a vessel, which he really would like to take as a prize. And he Bush makes a point of wondering at Hornblower's criticism of the prize system because, of course, all the rest of the Navy thinks prizes are awesome and an essential part of how they do things because it's it's their baby, it's their meal ticket. But Hornblower wishes that everyone just got paid a little more regularly. Anyway, uh, and so he's put in this position where it's like I would like to seize her as a prize, but she's getting away, and we've got to sink her while we still can, and so they sink her. And his men always seem to understand. So another step in making Hornblower a sympathetic character to American audiences who might mistake a system that was meant to incentivize aggressiveness for just simple greed, which of course I think it must have sometimes been. There must have been times where naval officers let their greed influence their strategic judgment, and so they, did the wrong thing from a military point of view because they were trying to get a prize. So Hornblower's criticisms are not wrong, which of course is partly why it's plausible. Another thing, so the era of Hornblower's time was known in Britain as a time of sort of vice and dissoluteness, and naval officers stationed overseas were, in a unique position to ignore, not unique, they were in a decent position to ignore social mores. But Hornblower never has sex. He just, I never thought I enjoy saying that. Hornblower never has sex. This isn't just, prudish Americanisms in the 30s and 40s. This was a rough rule for, popular fiction of the day. But they also never imply that he misses it or that he even really thinks about it. I can only think of a tiny throwaway remark in one of the books about him having a sort of riotous weekend in the Caribbean before taking up a cruise back across the Atlantic. But there's absolutely no specifics. It's left open that it might just be a bunch of drinking. And even there, Hornblower is not fond of drinking. He's, which this is important because a lot of the U.S. was still dry in the 30s and 40s. And even drinking a little bit of wine at dinner, often Forrester has Hornblower make the point that he doesn't really like wine, and he only does it because it's kind of his duty. They had all these ceremonial toasts that you had to give at naval dinners, and he often regrets drinking. And there is this appeal to the dry element of U.S. society. People can live with the idea of a character might drink, but they better pay a price for it, which Hornblower consistently does. And he never thinks about sex, which is, an appeal to the I don't want to say prudish, the abstemious elements in the potential Hornblower audience. If you have a character who's openly sexual, it's exciting, of course, and it opens up plot elements and it opens up directions that the story can take. But if your story is mostly about duty and doing the right thing under difficult conditions and overwhelming odds and just military heroism, it's not really necessary to have that in your story. And so for the people who might really disapprove of it, you don't get much back by putting it in. Now, there was a different audience for those kind of tales, more bodice ripper kind of stuff. I'm thinking here of like the author Raphael Sabatini, who always seemed to have a woman in a low-cut dress on the covers of his books. And those were very popular, but it was a different style. And it didn't usually have any general political point. They were just fun, It was like some cool dude with a sword and some beautiful women in old-timey dresses, and there'd be a bad guy with a mustache. And it was a whole tradition in theater and film and books that now is almost gone, though maybe it's due for some sort of revival. That was popular at the time. You could write that kind of thing and be popular, is my point. But Hornblower is more serious. Forrester's more serious, right? He wants to do this serious work, and so he has to leave some of that behind. Now, Hornblower does have some interest in love and in emotional um, intimacy. He does get married twice over the course of the series, and it's implied with his first marriage. He has children, so he but like everything happens off screen. Everything's happened. There is no deep entree of his emotions or his feelings. His first marriage is done out of duty, which would have also really appealed to audience. Hornblower is always doing the difficult thing because he feels he has to, which is a very appeal to the U.S. Protestant values kind of thing, and duty to country as well as to his own high expectations for himself. He has very high expectations for himself, and he's always letting himself down. People love this in a reader analog character because they want to reassure him, like, no, you're great. You're doing a great job. Don't worry. Everyone's going to see how great you are because I do. I'm the reader, and I see what's going on here, and you just got to be, it's just a very pleasant, I guess it's an example of pity. I don't mean that in a bad way at all. I mean that in a pathos, kind of like your heart goes out to him, and your heart goes out to Hornblower when his virtue, his hard work, his constant thinking about his duty, his endless efforts to improve himself. He's very much a self-improvement kind of guy. It looks like they will not be rewarded. Often the tension in the books comes not so much between Hornblower's confrontations with the enemy, like the French or the Spanish or whoever. It's about the tension is, will this character get justice? Will he be recognized? And will the burden that he's currently carrying, will he be allowed to put it down for a little while? Because that's very appealing to people. Pretty much everybody feels like they do more than their share and get less than they should. And Hornblower really does do more than his share and get less than he should, or barely enough, or credit only at the last minute. I remember there's one story that exemplifies this element. He has lost his ship to enemy engagement. And now we know, because we read a whole bunch about it, that he did it under tremendous heroic conditions. That he accomplished a great thing by doing so, that he stopped like a far superior force, and by pinning them down with his vessel and sacrificing his vessel, he made it possible to win this big victory. Again, the self-sacrifice, the duty. We know that because we read it. But whenever you lose a ship at the time, you have to undergo a court-martial, because the Navy and England was very concerned about any officers, showing cowardice or not doing all that they could. And so if anyone loses a ship, they investigate. And so, Hornblower, even though he knows he did everything, he did more than he should have. He did more than he could have done less. And he still stuck with it to do everything that he could and to sacrifice his crew and everything. And for briefly be imprisoned himself, caught by the enemy. He's still worried about it. He's still worried about this court-martial, because until it actually happens, until he's actually told that his actions were approved of by the rest of the Navy, anything's on the table. Like they had shot captains who were found not to have done their duty or to have behaved with cowardice in the face of the enemy. So even though he knows this, he still feels the tension. Because of that, we feel the tension. So when they reinvestigate the loss of the ship, and we get to hear from his surviving crew about his actions, and we get to hear from the other officers who were there about how his sacrifice allowed this victory to happen. We not only do we get like this kind of like release of tension, we get this like, finally someone sees what we do, which is that this guy is great. And then, of course, they give him back his sword, and he has the best of all possible outcomes, and he gets like a commendation from the board for his actions. And then he finds he's become a bit of a pop culture hero in England, that the Navy has been using his actions to build up support for the war. There were newspapers at this time, and that even the newspaper that Hornblower worried would be the most hostile to him approves. And this is the moment in like U.S. stories where justice happens in the form of like a ticker tape parade and massive press attention. And it's happening in the early 19th century on the scale of such events. And then it's just like a run to the finish of the book, just with one like happy event after another. A guy who he owes money to and had pawned something sends it back and says, "I was deeply moved by your story, and I can't possibly keep a note from a brave officer, so I'm tearing up your debt, and here's your stuff back." And he runs into Bush, and Bush is all happy because he's going to be able to take care of his sisters, and he finds out that his son, who he's healthy, had worried about his it's just a race to the finish. It's the Hollywood, like, one great thing after another happens, which Forrester knew so well. So yeah, Horatio Hornblower. I want to stress these are fun stories even now because of the research and because of the detail. These adventures really hold up, and Hornblower's character is built in such a well crafted way to appeal to all sorts of people. The hero who's never sure that he's done enough, unjustly persecuted by doubts about himself, which he then has to do another heroic deed in order to overcome. And if you wanted a nice series of heroic naval fiction, especially if you like naval language like mizzenmast and capstan bar, this is still a fine series, and it's still in print. And there was a A&E, the cable channel, made a mini series about 20 years ago, starring the fine actor Ewan Griffith as Hornblower. They made like 8 of those, and those were pretty good. They were pretty decent transcriptions of the early stories. So it doesn't seem like